Carrier was not thinking about comfort. He was thinking about ink. At the Sackett and Wilhelm's plant, multicolor printing required paper to pass through the press 4 separate times, once for each color. If humidity swelled the paper by even a fraction between passes, the colors landed out of register and the sheet was ruined. Buffalo Forge, his employer, built industrial heating equipment, not cooling systems, but the client's problem was clear: control the moisture in the air, or keep losing paper and profit. Carrier's answer was to pass air over chilled coils, wringing out the humidity the same way a cold glass sweats on a summer day. It was an engineering fix for a manufacturing headache, nothing more. But the underlying principle he refined that summer, controlling temperature through mechanical compression, belonged to a much older, much hungrier problem than printing ever posed. Long before anyone thought to cool a room, people had been trying to cool their food. That struggle began not with a machine, but with a block of pond ice and a young man from Boston willing to bet his fortune that the world was ready for winter, shipped. In February of 1806, a 23-year-old Bostonian named Frederic Tudor stood on a wharf watching an unlikely cargo get loaded onto his ship. The vessel was called the Favorite, and its hold carried 80 tons of ice cut from his father's pond in Saugus, bound for the sweltering port of Martinique. Tudor had spent winters skating on frozen New England ponds and summers sweating through visits to the Caribbean and the American South. And somewhere in that contrast, he had settled on an idea that struck nearly everyone around him as lunacy. Water that froze for free in a Massachusetts winter might be worth a fortune to people who had never once felt anything cold. The Boston Gazette covered his departure with open mockery, printing a notice that read, in essence, that a ship had cleared the harbor loaded with ice, and that the paper hoped this would not prove to be a slippery speculation. No shipping crew in Boston wanted the job, fearing that melting cargo would flood the vessel and sink it. So Tudor had been forced to buy the Favorite outright, spending nearly half of the $10,000 he had scraped together to fund the voyage. Whose idea was this, exactly? The record is not as clean as the Ice King legend later made it sound. Tudor's own sister, in a letter written decades afterward, credited the original scheme to their brother William, who had joked about selling ice to the West Indies at a family gathering. Tudor denied this fiercely for the rest of his life, and history has mostly sided with him, if only because he was the one willing to lose money, proving the idea could work. Lose money he did, immediately and repeatedly. The ice that survived the voyage to Martinique arrived to find no one had built anywhere to store it, so locals were left carrying blocks through midday heat in the open street, watching them turn to puddles before their eyes. Tudor's own account of the fiasco was blunt. Their methods of keeping it, he wrote, were laughable. One man dropped his allotment into a tub of water. Another packed his portion in salt. The venture cost Tudor and his brother roughly $2,500, a sum that would represent tens of thousands in today's money, and it was only the first of several early failures that would eventually land him in debtor's prison. He did not quit. Over the following decade, Tudor refined the parts of the business that had nothing to do with cutting ice and everything to do with keeping it frozen long enough to sell. He built double-walled ice houses, insulated with sawdust, wood shavings, and rice husks, structures that could hold blocks stacked like masonry through months of tropical heat. He opened storage depots in Havana, Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans, learning through repeated loss which insulating materials actually worked and which merely sounded clever on paper. By 1816, he was shipping ice to Cuba with an efficiency that had been unthinkable a decade earlier, and slowly, painfully, the business that had humiliated him in the Boston papers began turning a profit. What Tudor had actually solved was not a shipping problem in the narrow sense. He had solved the problem of persuasion, teaching entire regions of the world to want something they had never needed before, then building the infrastructure to keep that want satisfied. The real leap in scale came from a man who never froze a single pond himself. Tudor's supplier, a young engineer named Nathaniel Jarvis Wyeth, grew frustrated with the slow, back-breaking labor of hand-sawing ice blocks from frozen lakes. Around 1825, Wyeth harnessed a horse to a metal-bladed cutter, transforming ice harvesting from a crude seasonal chore into something closer to an assembly line. Blocks could now be cut in uniform sizes, stacked efficiently, and shipped with far less waste, and Tudor's production more than tripled almost overnight. The ice trade that had once been a rich man's eccentric gamble was becoming an industry with its own tools, its own labor force, and its own calendar, built entirely around when New England's ponds froze thick enough to cut. By the 1830s, Tudor was ready to attempt something that made his early Caribbean runs look modest by comparison. He packed a ship with 180 tons of ice and sent it toward Calcutta, a voyage of 16,000 miles that took 4 months to complete. Roughly 80 tons melted along the way, an enormous loss by any measure, but the remaining 100 tons still sold for a profit once they reached British colonists who had never in their lives tasted anything cold. A notice in the Calcutta Courier captured the astonishment on the receiving end, declaring that the first transport of ice from American shores to the banks of the Ganges deserved to be remembered alongside history's great benefactors of mankind. Within a few more decades, Tudor's ice was reaching Singapore, Hong Kong, and Rio de Janeiro, carried across oceans by a trade that had begun as a joke on a Boston dock. The scale this reached by mid-century is difficult to overstate. An official government survey of the ice industry, conducted belatedly in 1879, estimated that the national ice harvest ran between 8 and 10 million tons annually. New York City alone consumed nearly 1 million tons a year, much of it destined for breweries desperate to keep their product cold through the summer months. Chicago's meatpacking houses used hundreds of thousands of tons more, and along the Hudson River, more than 100 commercial ice houses lined the banks between New York and Albany, each one a monument to an industry nobody had planned to build. By the years leading into the Civil War, American ships were carrying more tonnage of ice than any commodity except cotton and grain, and 2 out of every 3 households in Boston and New York had come to expect a daily ice delivery as an ordinary fact of life, no different from milk or bread arriving at the door. In the brewing town of Munich, a professor named Karl von Linde faced a problem that had nothing to do with shipping and everything to do with the calendar. German law, at the time, restricted lager brewing to the cold months between October and March, since only frigid weather could keep fermenting beer at a stable temperature. Brewers who wanted to produce through the summer had no reliable way to do it, and a friend of Linde's, the brewer Gabriel Sedlmayr, asked him to find one. Linde was not trying to reinvent the ice trade or challenge Tudor's legacy in any way. He was trying to let a business operate in August the way it already operated in January, and the solution he arrived at would ultimately need nothing frozen, harvested, or shipped at all. Linde's first attempt, built for Munich's Spaten brewery in 1873, used dimethyl ether as its cooling agent and worked, but not safely. The gas leaked from its seals with alarming regularity, and on at least one occasion, the leaking ether caused an explosion that seriously injured a worker in the engine room. Linde spent the next several years redesigning the machine with his student Friedrich Schipper, replacing the volatile ether with ammonia and sealing the compressor with glycerin instead of the failure-prone gaskets that had caused the earlier accident. The redesigned machine, finished in 1876, weighed half as much as its predecessor and cost half as much to build. Linde sold it that September to the Dreher Brewery in Trieste, where it ran continuously for more than 3 decades before finally being retired. What Linde had built was fundamentally different from anything ice could offer. His compressor did not depend on a cold winter, a frozen pond, or a fleet of ships crossing an ocean before the cargo melted. It simply compressed ammonia gas, then allowed it to expand rapidly, and that expansion pulled heat directly out of the surrounding air with mechanical, repeatable precision. A brewery no longer needed to gamble on how much ice it had stored the previous winter or worry about running short during a particularly hot August. It needed only electricity, a working compressor, and a steady supply of ammonia, and it could manufacture exactly as much cold as it required, on demand, in any season. By 1890, Linde had sold more than 700 of these machines across Europe, and breweries were only the beginning of their reach. Slaughterhouses adopted the technology to keep meat from spoiling between kill and sale, and cold storage warehouses sprang up around rail lines, allowing perishable goods to sit safely for weeks rather than days. When Dublin's Guinness Brewery placed an order in the early 1890s for a carbon dioxide liquefaction plant, it pushed Linde's research even further into the deep cold that would later underpin industrial gas production, entirely separate from brewing. The ice trade did not vanish overnight, but its foundation had quietly become unnecessary. Ice cut from a Massachusetts pond still required weather nobody could control, storage that inevitably lost tonnage to melt, and a shipping network vulnerable to every delay an ocean could invent. A Linde compressor needed none of that. It ran through droughts, through mild winters, through whatever weather happened to be outside its factory walls, indifferent to the seasons that had once dictated the entire rhythm of Tudor's business. Slowly, industry by industry, the machines began outcompeting the harvest, not because they were cheaper at first, but because they were certain in a way nature had never agreed to be. That certainty eventually found its way toward the home, though not quickly, and not without a long string of expensive failures. Commercial-scale refrigeration had existed for decades by the time anyone seriously attempted to shrink the technology down to fit inside a household kitchen. An engineer named Fred Wolf built what is generally credited as the first home electric refrigerator in 1913, a unit that perched a compact refrigeration mechanism directly on top of an ordinary icebox. It worked, technically, but it worked expensively and unreliably, requiring frequent service calls from technicians who understood machinery that most homeowners could not begin to repair themselves. Mass production followed in 1918 when the automobile executive William Durant introduced a home refrigerator built around a fully self-contained compressor, folding the entire mechanism into a single unit rather than an awkward attachment bolted onto an existing icebox. Even so, these early machines cost between $500 and $1,000 apiece, a price that, adjusted into today's terms, would sit somewhere between roughly $6,500 and $13,000. A refrigerator, in other words, cost as much as a modest automobile, and it was treated by nearly everyone who could afford one as exactly that kind of luxury. Before the compressor reached the kitchen, cold was a daily errand, not a fixture. A wooden icebox sat in the corner, lined with tin or zinc, holding whatever the previous day's ice block had left behind. It needed tending. It needed watching. Every household running one had a card in the window. The card told the iceman how much to bring that day: 25 pounds, 50, 75, 100, for a family with more mouths or more heat to fight. He would arrive by horse cart, later by truck, hauling blocks with iron tongs into kitchens and pantries across the neighborhood. Children ran after his wagon for scraps of ice on hot afternoons, a small mercy that cost him nothing and meant everything to them. A single block lasted about a week, sometimes less. It depended on the weather, the quality of the insulation, and how often the icebox door swung open. Every opening let warm air in and let cold air escape, so a house full of children meant a house that burned through ice faster than a house without them. A drip pan sat beneath the cabinet, catching the meltwater, and someone had to empty it daily or risk a flooded floor. That someone was almost always a woman, and the task was one line among dozens on a list that never fully emptied. Shopping followed the same rhythm as the ice. There was no buying ahead, no stocking a week's worth of meat or milk on a single trip, because nothing in the box could be trusted to hold that long. A housewife planned her meals around what would spoil first, not around what she wanted to cook. Milk soured quickly if the block had melted low. Meat turned before it could be used twice. Leftovers survived a day, sometimes two, rarely longer, and a mistake in timing meant food thrown out and money wasted in a household that likely had little to spare. The labor behind the ice itself was harder still and far less visible from any kitchen window. Ice harvesting was seasonal, brutal work carried out on frozen lakes and ponds through the coldest months of the year. Men cut blocks by hand at first, then with horse-drawn plows once the tools improved, hauling slabs of ice weighing hundreds of pounds across surfaces that could crack without warning. Falling through thin ice was a real and recurring danger, one that killed workers whose names rarely made it into any record at all. The industry needed thousands of such men every winter, in New England, along the Hudson, on lakes as far west as Wisconsin, all of it timed to a season that gave no guarantees. A mild winter meant a thin harvest. A thin harvest meant a shortage that summer, and a shortage meant families making do with less cold for longer, regardless of how much they were willing to pay. Even the poorest households wanted in. Families who could not afford the cheapest icebox still found ways to keep something cold. Some kept blocks of ice directly in the bathtub, a crude but functional stand-in for the cabinet they could not buy. The want for cold, once created, did not respect income. It simply changed the method by which people tried to satisfy it. While the electric refrigerator was still fighting its way into ordinary kitchens, a very different kind of cold was being discovered nearly 2,000 miles to the north by a man who had gone there to trap foxes, not to reinvent food. Clarence Birdseye arrived in Labrador in 1912, a 25-year-old naturalist working for the United States Department of Agriculture, and he stayed on afterward to build a modest fur trading operation of his own. He was not thinking about supermarkets or frozen dinners. He was thinking about how to eat well in a place where fresh food arrived rarely, and boredom with the same preserved rations set in fast. It was the local Inuit fishermen who showed him something he had never seen before. They would pull trout straight from a hole cut through thick ice, and in air that dropped to nearly 40 degrees below zero, the fish would freeze almost on contact, sometimes still mid-motion. Packed afterward in snow and left outdoors, it could be thawed weeks later and cooked, and it tasted, to Birdseye's genuine surprise, essentially fresh. This ran against everything he understood about frozen food from home, where commercially frozen fish had a well-earned reputation for turning grainy and flavorless after thawing. He began keeping careful notes in his journals, trying to understand exactly why the Labrador method produced something so different from what any American icebox or cold storage warehouse could manage. The answer, he eventually worked out, came down to speed. Slow freezing, the standard method used commercially at the time, gave ice crystals time to grow large inside the food's cells, rupturing their walls and ruining the texture the moment the food thawed. The Inuit method froze the fish so quickly that the resulting ice crystals stayed small and did minimal damage, leaving the cellular structure largely intact. Birdseye returned to the United States in 1917 with this insight lodged firmly in his mind. Though it would take years, several failed companies, and a great deal of borrowed money before he found a way to reproduce Arctic conditions inside a Massachusetts factory. His first venture, founded in 1922, folded within 2 years after burning through borrowed capital on experiments that ranged from packing fish in various salts to freezing samples in front of an electric fan in a desperate attempt to mimic Labrador's wind. He relocated to Gloucester, a fishing port with the infrastructure and expertise he lacked elsewhere. And there, he finally built a machine capable of doing at industrial scale what the Inuit had done by instinct on a frozen lake. His double-belt freezer pressed packaged fish between two refrigerated metal surfaces, chilling it so rapidly that the small, harmless ice crystals he needed formed reliably every time. General Seafood Corporation, the company built around this machine, began selling quick frozen fish commercially in 1924. And 5 years later, Birdseye sold the company and its patents to the Boston Cereal Company and Goldman Sachs for $22 million, a sum that instantly dwarfed everything he had lost in his earlier failures combined. Boston, soon renamed General Foods, folded Birdseye's patents into a new venture called Birdseye. But the public took far longer to embrace frozen food than the technology itself had taken to mature. Through the 1930s, quick frozen vegetables and fish remained a curiosity in most American grocery stores. Hampered by the expense of the specialized freezer cases retailers needed to stock them, and by a lingering public memory of what frozen food had tasted like before Birdseye's process existed. The real shift came with wartime necessity. During the Second World War, a shortage of tin for canning pushed both the government and ordinary households toward frozen alternatives out of pure material scarcity, not preference. At the same moment, with millions of men serving overseas, women were entering paid work outside the home in numbers the country had never seen before, and any food that saved preparation time suddenly carried a value it had never held in peacetime. Frozen vegetables that could go straight from freezer to pot, requiring no washing, no peeling, no long simmer to soften, fit a household schedule that had fundamentally changed. By the 1950s, that wartime necessity had hardened into a permanent habit, and the industry it created reshaped the American grocery store from the ground up. Supermarkets began building entire sections around refrigerated and frozen cases, a layout that would have been architecturally pointless a generation earlier, when no such inventory existed to display. The television dinner arrived in this decade as well, a single tray holding a complete meal, frozen, portioned, and designed to be heated and eaten in front of a set that was becoming a fixture in its own right. Together, these developments did something the icebox era had never managed. They decoupled the timing of a meal from the timing of a harvest, a delivery, or a season entirely. Vegetables picked in one region during their brief growing window could now be frozen at peak ripeness and sold months later, thousands of miles away, to a household that had never seen the field they came from. Willis Carrier never set out to build any of this. He went on to found his own company, watched air conditioning spread from printing plants into hotels, theaters, and eventually ordinary homes, and died in 1950. Remembered mainly as the father of a comfort technology that had started as a fix for wet paper and misaligned ink. He almost certainly never thought of himself as connected to Tudor's ice ships, Linday's brewery compressor, or Birdseye's frozen trout. Yet the coils he chilled in that Brooklyn plant ran on the same basic principle that eventually kept a Trieste brewery cold through summer, that eventually shrank down small enough to fit inside a kitchen, and that eventually made a frozen dinner possible on the far side of the world from where it was grown. Somewhere in your home right now, a refrigerator is humming quietly in the corner, holding food at a steady temperature it never has to be asked to maintain. There is no card in a window this week, no iceman due this afternoon, no drip pan to empty before it floods the floor. Inside, there may be fish from a coast you have never visited, vegetables picked months ago on a different continent, meat that traveled farther to reach your kitchen than Tudor's ice ever traveled to reach Calcutta. None of it required a single thought from you about spoilage, about timing, about which ingredient needed to be used first before it turned. That ease is not ordinary. It is the end point of a printing plant's humidity problem, a brewer's frustration with the German calendar, and a fur trader's curiosity about how a fish could freeze mid-flip and still taste like it had just been caught. The next time that hum fades into background noise, worth remembering, it took a Boston merchant's ruin, a Bavarian engineer's compressor, and an Arctic winter borrowed from people who never asked for credit, just to make it possible to forget that cold was ever something you had to fight for.